Welcome, everyone, to the 360 Insights conversation. With me today is Jeff Cates, Chief Executive Officer of Achievers. Several weeks ago, Jeff and I were introduced and had a very interesting conversation around the philosophy and principles behind employee recognition, which Achievers software drives. What's the compelling rationale to recognize employees with intentionality, invest in the software to do so? These are some of the questions that we explored last time, and we decided to schedule a video cast to revisit these and other ideas. Jeff, welcome. Why don't you give us a little more context, just a little bit, as to what Achievers does, and we'll take it from there. Sound good?
Yeah, that's great. Well, Achievers is predominantly in the recognition, reward, and voice of employee categories. But if we anchor kind of in our macro, our goal is to change the way the world works. And what we mean by that is we're trying to make a meaningful difference in the greater than 70% of employees that are not fully engaged. And there's lots of ways to do that, right? There's lots of things that drive engagement, but the core things we anchor around is creating a sense of belonging in the organization, belongingness, connectedness, and how do we build better people leaders? So everything we do anchors around those things: belongingness, connectedness, better people leaders. So recognition happens to be one of the most impactful things that managers can do, or employees can do for that matter, to create a sense of belongingness and connectedness. Where we're focused is those core things of driving behavior through things like recognition, through voice of employee that provides insights and then drives actions that leaders will take that will drive the employee experience, and use technology to nudge that behavior, to oil the gears, if you will, is what we're all about. Essentially, we're at the intersection of workforce science, behavioral science, and technology, with kind of data in the center.
That's really interesting, and that's a lot. So a few things that come to mind. First of all, employee recognition sounds to me as if employee recognition is as good a place to start as any, and perhaps the best place to start if an organization has that sort of that moment of realization where, you know what, we should pay more attention to our employer culture. We want to improve this employer culture. We have this, so you have that impetus of wanting to get better at that as an organization, which is always a positive thing. Would you say that employee recognition is probably the best place to start? I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but
yeah, you know, it's interesting in terms of big swings of the industry over the decades. You know, voice of employee kind of really started to get in vogue in the 80s, certainly in the 90s. By the 2000s, it became like, you know, if you're not tracking voice of employee to some extent, you're not aligned with good business management practices, because at that time there was lots of data coming out saying higher engagement equals higher profitability, revenue, customer sat, etc. And that's continued to build momentum, and the trend has become like an annual or every 2-year survey does not actually drive any change. You're measuring something way after the fact. Now what's happening is, so now you're getting much more frequent like polling and right, the rise of the quarterly pulse is the natural evolution. And that's great. That's a measuring stuff at the end. But if you look below VOE, below voice of employee, what really drives engagement? Well, recognition. Like I'm rewarded for the things I do. I'm recognized for my efforts, both, first of all, most importantly, from the manager, then from the superior above the manager or the CEO, depending on the organizational structure, and then peers. All three matter, but they're in that order. The data will show that they're in that order. And so what the next evolution, I think, is like peeling the onion back below the voice of employee and really anchoring around like what energy can we put in that truly is going to move the needle. And there's some basics. Recognition matters. One-on-one meetings matter. Like there's a core set that, man, if you can just like get really good at doing that, you can drive much better productivity, much better performance, much better culture as a result.
What kind of things does Achievers technology do to facilitate that interaction and recognition?
Yeah, so what's core, so before, I'll just talk a little how the categories evolved.
Sure.
So the category evolved predominantly around rewarding things like years of service, right? Back in the 70s, 80s, when it was all about, long lifetime, retaining employees for long periods of time. And that kind of started to change in the 90s and the 2000s. It was like, look, we recognize that attrition is a thing and people are moving, especially as things, as technology becomes more prevalent. And so it's about ensuring that you are rewarding real-time behavior and not putting all your emphasis on, have you been here 10 years and you get a watch?
Oh,
and
right, right. Milestones. Sorry to interrupt, but as opposed to arbitrary milestones, right? Because those are arbitrary, even though they seem set in stone, they're sort of arbitrary, as opposed to really having that happen in real time in the moment when it matters most.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure they're necessarily arbitrary, but they're just those are good things to do. It is not a bad thing to recognize a 1 year, a 5 year, a 10 year, or whatever. But it's not behavior changing. Right? It's not really behavior changing. It's a nice thing to do. It's a good thing to do. People like it, but it's not behavior changing. Behavior changing. Maybe you would say the reward in the form of a bonus at the end of the year is behavior. Well, okay, yes, it is to some extent. It's a guiding light. People think about it, but it's not day-to-day behavior changing. Day-to-day behavior changing is when you have like a daily or a weekly like positive reinforcement for how you're performing a job or what you're driving. And that's been the evolution of the category. It went from rewards that were largely about pins, pens, and trophies, and then it became more around like rewarding in a more personalized, frequent way. And then it's kind of shifted to like what really matters is the recognition, which may or may not have some sort of monetary component. And so organizations are saying, look, we're spending all of this money in often cases on these things that actually don't drive real behavior. And so take money away from these things that don't really drive right behavior and reallocate them to real behavior changing, recognition. And that's amazing to see that evolution.
What's interesting, what you just said made me think of something, because there's been chatter and data flying around, studies for a long time around, what really motivates employees, and obviously you have to pay them, but there are limitations to paying them more. At some point it's not necessarily that motivating factor, just like you mentioned, right? Now you talking about this idea of the behavior changing day-to-day actions, which are outside of that, the different types of activities, right? It occurred to me that one can't really exist without the other. So for instance, if you had, let's say that I guess let me ask you that, just as a maybe even a caricature of an example, right? Just for the sake of this conversation, let's say that you have an organization that really can't pay its employees that much. Maybe it's a nonprofit, and most of its employees are, they're on board with the mission. Maybe they're there because they really believe in the mission. So maybe we have some motivation there already. To what extent can day-to-day behavioral changing actions be a counterweight to possibly, fairly low pay?
Very much so. You will join a company and you will join with a salary, and you either join or you don't join, right? So if you chose that salary and you join the company, you probably joined the company for a reason. It could be mission, it could be team, it could be role, like experience you want, but you join that. Now, over time, you might get some sort of some sort of concern around salary. Maybe you found out what somebody else was getting paid. Maybe a headhunter called you. So for sure, at some point, you might get some sort of inequity there that starts to preoccupy your thoughts. But most people don't wake up in the morning thinking like, I'm really upset because I don't get paid enough. What they get worried about is like, my manager isn't seeing what I'm doing, or I just worked my butt off for this and nobody saw it or recognized it. I mean, that's where you really you get angst within an organization. And so, yeah, I think that, of course, you've got to attract people into your organization with the right pay, and you need to keep that somewhat competitive. But in reality, most of the real energy, positive energy and negative energy, is more around the day-to-day interactions and the feedback and the recognition you're getting. So yes, you will find that organizations that have high recognition have much higher engagement and have much lower attrition, right? We've proven that. Organizations like Kellogg's have looked at managers that recognize more and their attrition rate, employee attrition rate versus others, that it's significantly lower. And so that tells you that high active usage of a manager recognizing people is creating a better sense of well, it's largely belongingness and connectedness in the organization or job satisfaction. That means that they're not spending time thinking like, well, I'm not getting paid enough for this. So for sure, you can get a better bang for your compensation buck if you're putting energy towards the things that truly drive behavior changing and emotionally charged, positively emotionally charged environments, versus just relying on, I need to increase the salary at the end of the year. That's such a blunt exercise, and it's really not. It's not really where people's behavior is really anchored on. Until it gets really knocked off, then it might. But in most cases, that's not the case.
This is really illuminating, and it really hits the nail on the head around some, there is some go-to default thinking around what's going to motivate employees versus what the science says does, and it's so important to clarify that for the market. And you know what's interesting? We're getting into this idea of how do you justify the value. How do you justify the value in investing in an employee recognition software specifically? So this might be a little bit of a bigger conversation, but let's tackle this. So one, there is employee recognition happening most of the time in most organizations, but it's sort of organic, and some organizations it's happening more than in others. There's probably some percentage of employers where it's barely happening at all, right? But there's sort of these unofficial, just organically surfacing channels of employee recognition. We're actually talking about two things, but so one, how do you go to an organization and tell them, hey, this is already happening at your organization. It would be worth your while. It would be, justifiable from a financial standpoint, right? I think what we discussed earlier was systematizing the employee recognition. And how do you go into that conversation? How do you sort of make the case for bringing order to the employee recognition?
Yeah. It's interesting. It's, if you ask an HR leader and most business leaders, they'll say, like, we know what great looks like in this. And it doesn't have to be digitized. It can be gift, it can be like I signed a card and at the birthday, we all signed the card at the town hall. We recognize people for their, there are lots of ways to show recognition. But they take energy. They're particularly hard to do many of those other things non-digitized when you're in a remote work environment. Mm-hmm. Right? I no longer, it's not easy for me to pass a gift or a birthday card around, and so it's tough to measure those things, right? It's tough to see that you're driving consistency and best practices. Mm-hmm. And so essentially what we're saying is, like, what great looks like because you see it from the people leaders, and you can tell because you can look at their employee engagement scores and that they're the better people leaders, and it's not hard to see how they show up and why, right? Mm-hmm. What a recognition system does, a platform does, it enables you to actually be able to track, like measure. Yeah. Are the managers recognizing? Are the execs recognizing? It enables you to see the quality. Like, hey, when you recognize that way, that's not very meaningful. It allows you to look at diversity. Are we recognizing some pockets of employees versus others? And it enables you to coach. And it removes a lot of the friction that might get in the way of actually recognizing, right? If it's hard to send the birthday card around or the anniversary card or the like, hey, we just won this deal, let's bring everybody together, then it's less likely to happen. A platform brings all those things together, measurable, you can actually coach on it, and you're removing the friction. So that's the core of what you're saying is a digitized platform for recognition enables you to bring these together and be more purposeful and impactful.
Right.
What normally happens is it usually comes from either one of two things. It will come from the voice of employee survey. And somebody says, wow, recognition's off. Hey, somebody in HR, can you go figure that out and go fix that? And they're like, oh, recognition's off, we should get a recognition platform. Cool, that's great, no problem, we'll take that. The other will often come from reward. They'll say like, look, we got people out buying gift cards from CVS and they're buying it on their credit card and this is like a fraud waiting to happen. And we're spending money all over these places and we really don't think we're getting our money for our reward. And that also is a benefit of a consolidated reward platform. Okay. And then they start looking at like recognition as part of a reward platform. Those are your two probably like on-ramps, if you will, in the category. The third is any HR leader that has had a recognition program, or often a CEO that's had a recognition program, moves to another company and like, oh my gosh, how could we operate without it? Those are the three entries. So that's what we kind of anchor around is like, look, if you're looking to consolidate reward platforms and get more bang for your buck, we try to explain that and quantify it. If you're looking to consolidate around recognition, like actually driving a culture of recognition, how do you create a culture of recognition? And of course, we'll look for executives that already have seen the power of a platform and say, great, now let's bring that to your new company because you know how powerful it is in terms of driving culture. That's smart
Because there's so many different things in what you just described and explained. So one is this idea that, and it feeds into the building leaders, the piece of your solution, which is identifying people who have those people leader skills, right? And I think that's what you're getting. So much of the culture really the culture originates in the leaders of the organization. It's occurred to me thinking about this over time. It really does. The leader is really sort of that origin of the culture. So much emanates from the leader in terms of what the organizational culture is. It could be, whatever that person is, it kind of manifests in the organization. There are other factors at play, but it's so much of it hinges on the leaders, right? So it's very interesting that it makes so much sense. It's smart that leaders that already get it would want this. Another thing that's really interesting about what you said, though, is thinking about employee recognition. Before you and I spoke, it wouldn't necessarily have occurred to me that there's an efficiency play there, but there is. And that's super smart. So if you have an organization so there's a building block. You have that organization that first it understands that employee recognition is important, probably coming from that leader that's on board with the idea. Now that leader sees and this gets in the concrete versus abstract HCM, which we've been talking a lot about at 3Sixty Insights. There's actually a concrete aspect to employee recognition around efficiency once the abstraction of the notion that, hey, employee recognition, we need to have this is there, that it's agreed upon, right? So that's really interesting to me. Just some observations.
Yeah, really, what you're seeing in the HR space, arguably HR is the last dominion to go, well, maybe legal as well, that are going through this digitization process, right? Like marketing went through it a long time ago, where it's actually it's not there. Sure, there's an element of art. But it's largely science now, right? We make smart decisions around where we're investing. We track, we optimize, we test and learn. It's digitized. HR has been kind of this, softer discipline of art. But now what's happening is we're digitizing those processes so we can actually really start to break things down, leading, lagging indicators. Like if attrition is the output, well then like what caused attrition? And we're working our way back to look at like what truly happened, what behaviors truly drive the outcomes that we're looking for. And so that, recognition is just happens to be a beautiful place to do this, because with platform, you literally can track, measure, coach, and you can start to use that. Where we're going with our platform is, sure, surface insights to the manager real time, surface insights to the HR, the HRBP business partner, to say, look, you might want to go coach on this for sure. But what we really want to do is start to then nudge the leader and say, you might have a blind spot here, or you should consider the following, right? You might want to do this. Or we can say, using language processing, we can say hey, when you say words that way, it won't be as effective. You might want to consider that. And so our goal is to use behavioral science and technology to actually be nudging the behaviors real time. We're going to put data in front of the managers and say, look, you be more effective, and here's how you know that. Now let's explain. That's compelling reason. Oh, okay, I want that output. Great. Now let's teach you why, and then let's actually give you practical experience where possible to say you'd be better to word it this way. Right. And if we can do that, we no longer have to have HRBPs have to become the coaches, or even the managers of the managers of the managers becoming coaching. The technology can be actually guiding on the behavior and nudging real time, without having to send people off to classes, to learn, right? We can actually guide the right behavior. That will be what great will look like, not only in this category, but when you cascade it beyond into other areas around people leadership, where call it HR tech can play a role. We've got to be coaching real time, nudging real time. That's how you make a movement.
Yeah, and you know what? That's interesting. It also gets to the really to the crux of why the data is so important, right? Because you have an organization that has, let's say you have all the raw ingredients in place for a positive employer culture. You have a leader that it's a great leader, understands that that this is important, cares about his or her people, right, and all that. But nobody's perfect. Everybody can get better at being a leader, and using that data to inform the analytics that provide sort of almost a leadership prosthetic for the leader to be even better at that. And so that's really interesting, is you wouldn't think of, well, look at it another way, right? Everybody thinks of employee recognition as being, so it's unidirectional maybe, right? It comes from leadership and it flows to the employees, and that's all positive, right? But it's actually a feedback loop. It's actually feeding information back to leadership as well, and the data makes it possible.
Yeah, couple of thoughts is, one, if you really want to create a culture of gratitude and recognition, another way to say that is, I want to create a culture of positive reinforcement guiding towards values and towards behaviors and outcomes you want. You can say it either way. I want a culture of gratitude and recognition, or I want to positively reinforce the values and the productivity I want. Either of them are the same thing, one's below the other. Right. You don't want, it's passed down. That's reward mechanism mindset. Yes, for sure. People managers need to be recognizing real time. Again, the data shows that. That's super, super impactful. Then you want the people above recognizing. That's for career progression and a variety of other things. So that's important too. But it is important to have peer-to-peer. It is, you stayed last night and you helped me. It is the like, I recognize that you didn't have to help me onboard that way, but you did. That is peer-to-peer coaching, peer-to-peer positive reinforcement feedback. So you really want a culture that has that positive reinforcement as much as you can, anchored around the value system, right? How you operate as much as you can, because that's what builds a culture of productivity or a culture of performance. Yeah. The other thought is, much like marketing, as we look at how do we drive behaviors, how do we drive thinking, the more we can personalize that content to you. Think Facebook, think LinkedIn, right? Yeah. The more we know, like, what you're interested in right now, and the way we can deliver that to you in a way that would be meaningful to you, the more likely we are to get you to take action, right? So marketing is like leading in this space. Well, that is the next evolution, I think, of nudging and personalizing in this space too. If I know that Brent's behavioral style is the following, Brent prefers recognition over reward. His love language is, recognition over reward, and he prefers public over private, and he prefers team over individual. Then I can now, like, if I knew that about you and I thought about it, then I would write something that would be tailored to that, right? And I would put the private setting on or off setting. I'd recognize a group person if I knew that. But I don't always think about that. And I may not actually have thought about that with you. I just think, hey, you think the way I think. So the more we can inject that actually personalized behavioral knowledge of this person's behavioral style is the following, and we can translate that into actions, whether that's recognition or that's how I have a one-on-one engagement with you, the more we actually make it much easier to create that sense of belongingness, connectedness between the people leader and the individuals below, or between the other leaders and them below, right? So I'm really excited where this industry will go as we're able to use things like behavioral models to hyper-personalize insights and nudges to drive belongingness. It's super exciting space.
It is exciting. By the way, you described me to a T. Just kidding. but you know what? It's interesting what you're saying. It goes back again to that prosthetic for the leader. You have a leader that has that positive impulse to want to engage in a positive way with that employee, but may have sort of a flawed understanding of how to approach that employee, right? Yeah. And so you have this data that helps to inform that activity so that ahead of time, so that it can be as effective as possible. And this actually gets into the behavioral science and all that, but also this gets into you mentioned NLP earlier, right? And NLP being, kind of artificial intelligence. I know that it falls under that category of it, at least for now, not necessarily being true artificial intelligence, but can we just hit on that just for a little bit? Because I'm curious, how do you see AI bolstering employee recognition?
Yeah, so your big areas where I think it will make a meaningful difference. Well, let me start where it is today. You see, let's take NLP. You see natural language processing solving core problems that people have. Usually there's a massive amount of qualitative data and you're trying to shrink it down, right? So it was used for CX purposes, right? Looking at NPS surveys and trying to bring out the core themes out of it. And now that's being applied to employee engagement. If you have a large organization, you get a lot of qualitative feedback in your engagement score, and you're trying to bring that down and pull out the key insights. So that's been I'd say the largest area that we've really seen that used, because it's a real problem. And now, where we'll evolve to is using that using NLP more to be able to look at an input or output, call that the performance management report. Any of those engagements where it's digitized and you can track it, and then the NLP can actually look at that and it can guide on it. It can say, hey, this wasn't a good, this wasn't the right way to say something after the fact. Maybe, think about what you now see in sales coaching. You'll turn on an app that's tracking how much time did you talk versus the customer talk, what words did you use, how many times did you mention the following, right? Well, it's the same kind of thing for now looking past tense at the experience between the manager and the employee, where it will then evolve to is actually real-time nudging. It's one thing to wait and after the fact say, hey, you should have done the performance management differently, to real time be able to nudge on like, hey, before you write that, you might want to write it this way, or whether it be any sort of digitized connections. So I think that's where it will go to, is it's moving from solving a real problem of aggregating, and then it goes to a helping to actually track for coaching purposes, and then it will evolve to like actually nudging real-time behavior, so you don't even have to coach on it because it's coaching real time, which is really exciting. Then you'll see more. I'm not sure it's necessarily artificial intelligence, but there's a lot more room around better predictive analytics that will then kind of shape, again, more nudging of like, hey, we think we're going to have a problem in this area. Let's call attrition. Or maybe we have a customer sat problem. We say we have a customer sat problem. Why do we have a customer sat problem? You work back and you'll be connecting different data points like your recognition system, maybe your HRS system, maybe your CI. Be looking at that to see where there's correlations. And using that to identify behaviors across those systems. If you look at what behaviors are actually going to nudge the right outcomes. So going back to recognition, for example, there's data to show that companies or stores that have higher recognition have higher CSAT scores. So companies that have taken their CX platform and they've taken their recognition platform and they've mapped that data together and they say, look, there's this correlation. To really know that. Now, how can you actually use the technology to be nudging? Where do you have managers or employees where you need to actively coach to improve that? You improve that, and then you should, hypothetically, see the same kind of outcomes in terms of the customer experience they're going to have. Not solely, of course, it requires other things, but we know these things are tightly linked, so you can actually pinpoint, let's go pay attention there.
And you mentioned, I think I heard you say stores. So you're talking. Did I hear you correctly? You said stores.
Yeah, I'm just giving an example.
The retail
like,
space.
Example, yeah, Super Retail Group, for example, they did an analysis and they looked for their environment. They looked at recognition to store customer satisfaction at store level.
Yeah.
Others have done that too. They've looked at restaurants. Same thing. Restaurants that have high active usage of recognition, lots of recognition sent, have higher store performance and higher scores.
Yeah, and you know what? It makes a lot of sense. But sometimes you have to have that data in place to really convince the larger population. And what's interesting, that actually fits in with, and I think we're running close to the end of our time, but that fits in with the service profit chain, which I think is a concept that was espoused on Harvard Business Review several years back. This idea that the more engaged your floor staff is in the retail space, and of course, the restaurant space being a close cousin to that and all of that, hospitality, the more engaged that your workforce is, happier, the more engaged or apt to return to your store for more business will be your customers. I totally mangled the way I said that, but I think everybody is probably clear. Yeah, so there's definitely a symbiosis there. It makes a lot of sense. If you're going to have disengaged or unhappy floor staff, then that vibe is definitely going to be sensed by the clientele, and you're going to have some trouble there. What's interesting also is what you're talking about is you talked about a culture of recognition and gratitude, or you can call it a culture that reinforces our mission and drives productivity, right? And those, it's funny that you have folks that'll think of one or the other, and and I think what we're talking about today is that they completely, they feed each other. It's, you can't have one without the other, and it's almost hokey to say so, but I will say that again goes back to concrete and abstract HCM. The concrete objectives of or just concrete and abstract for business, right? The concrete objectives are to reinforce the mission and drive productivity, right? But you can't have that without appreciating, respecting, and practicing a culture of appreciation, appreciated recognition and gratitude. Excuse me. Yeah, it's really interesting stuff, Jeff.
To it, recognition in particular is so important for how you actually drive behavior and actions. If it is so important, then you want to have a scalable way to measure it, to manage it, and to positively reinforce it. And if you can do that, it's arguably one of the most important things you can do to actually drive business success. It's critical.
Yeah.
But say it's the more that we're able to connect these things together and actually get hard facts on this causes this, which causes this, the more that the category will develop, and it will be considered like, how could you operate an organization without it? It's still in its infancy of being able to bring those data correlations together, so people can really see that and build the business case. And that's really what's in front of us as leaders in the industry. How do we help create that awareness for why it's just so mission critical to build your culture, build your people management practice around a system that allows you to scale that and do all those things.
It's a worthy charter, yeah, and I think you put it just really well. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a fantastic conversation. Learned a lot. It's very interesting to me. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks for the opportunity, Brent.
Take care. Bye-bye.